if you all remember from the last lecture, we're talking about the development of the Jamestown colony. And remember, this was strictly a money-making organization entity. The Virginia Company, which got permission from the king to build the colony, did it for the purpose of making money. Now, at first, it was a very touch-and-go type of thing. There was nothing to make money on. Virginia is not laden with gold or riches or spices or anything else like that. It took them a while to discover that the main cash crop is going to be, remember? Tobacco. Tobacco becomes the foundation, the focal point of the Virginia colony for the remainder of the colonial era. Now, with the success of Jamestown, you begin to see a mass exodus, a large movement of people from England and Great Britain in general, Ireland, Scotland, whatever, into the colonies. Now, even though the colony of Virginia was founded for economical purposes, you have another colony being founded for the complete opposite, for religious purposes. Now, excuse me, if you all recall, when Henry VIII established the Act of Supremacy and created the Church of England, he basically took most of the traditions and rites and ceremonies and festivals of the Catholic Church and just kept them. So in many senses, the Church of England was the Diet Coke of Catholicism, as I like to call it. Now, there are many within England who disagree with this, who believe that the church is basically, again, a Diet Coke version of Catholicism. It's basically Catholicism with a couple of changes. And so, to them, that is too Catholic. That is too much Catholicism. And so, you have those within the Church of England who want to purify, reform the church, so that all the Catholic vestiges are kind of eliminated. These, of course, are called Puritans. Now, there are some who believe that the church is, needless to say, already corrupt as it is. The church is corrupt, and there's no point in trying to reform it. And so you have those who want to separate entirely from the Church of England, separatists. Now, both sections, Puritans and separatists, both begin seeing a lot of support in England, starting in the early 1600s. And this eventually led to persecutions. Now, the previous monarch of England, Elizabeth, had kind of tolerated the Puritans and the separatists, kind of for the most part let them alone, they left her alone. But with Elizabeth's death and the reign of her cousin, Charles, you begin to see things changing. Where all of a sudden this fragile peace between Puritans and the crown basically start to break. And so, you begin to see persecutions, particularly of separatists, those who refuse to pay. Now, keep in mind, if you are living in England, regardless of your faith, you may be Calvinist, you may be Catholic, you may be whatever, you have to pay tithes to the Church of England. It's almost like paying taxes. You have to pay them. You are officially a member of the Church of England, whether you like it or not. And so, there are many who refuse to pay these tithes. And if you refused, you were basically, there was a warrant out for your arrest. So these persecutions continued. And so, here's the thing, is that for many Puritans and separatists, they saw the desire to live in a land that was based off of their ideals, based off of their interpretation of what the Bible says, this concept of moral liberty, that their morality should be free from any type of corruption, any type of thing that offends them. So this kind of ties into the general arc of what we've been discussing so far, and even though your textbook discusses a lot, this idea of liberty. Remember, because the idea of liberty and freedom is one that is very, very different based on persons. In this case, what they define as liberty is one out of freedom of religious persecution. One where you can establish the laws of God according to what you would think the laws of God are. Now, so here's the thing. We'll pick up the story, again, we're starting off in England, but here, with the fear of persecution, many separatists, decided to flee England to come to nearby Holland. The Netherlands, Holland, remember, same thing. Here in Holland, you have much more religious toleration than you have in England. And so the separatists here were allowed to practice their religion freely, live free of persecution, etc., things were good, just one problem. As time progresses, these separatists began having children, and these children are growing up not English, but Dutch. They speak Dutch. They begin learning the Dutch, the Dutch written language. They begin practicing Dutch customs, and to many English this is simply not acceptable. And so there is a desire to maybe go to the New World and found a colony based off of English puritanical principles. All right? And so the separatists living in in Holland, strike a deal with the Virginia Company. All right, the Virginia Company is still around, and they come up with a compromise. Right, the Virginia Company will pay for the voyage of these separatists, about 200 or so of them, all right, to go to the New World in exchange for becoming indentured servants. All right, indentured servitude is still very much a thing, if y'all recall. And so they do. The separatists agree. However, there is a slight disagreement on board the ship on where exactly are they going to land. It was assumed to be Virginia, but the separatists kind of bully the captain of the ship to travel further north here. All right, and eventually landed what is now Massachusetts in 1620. Now, technically this is illegal. All right, what they're doing is not only a breach of contract, but this land is technically not part of the English colony. Right? And this is exactly what the Puritans want. They want to be able to live outside of the auspices of the English crown. Right? Basically, they started a colony on their own. Basically committing treason right now. Nonetheless, right, this they eventually decide on the spot. All right, and on the ship that I'm referring to here, they essentially established on the deck of the Mayflower, they come up with an agreement, which to this day is known as the Compact. Now, many textbooks, even in elementary school and in high school, will call this the first constitution in U.S. history, and it's not. The Mayflower Compact is basically an agreement. Now, here's the thing. The Mayflower is not just holding Puritan settlers. They're also holding just regular people who have signed indentured servitude contracts and want to come to the New World to work. And so all of a sudden now, they're stuck in this experiment that the Puritans are trying to create. So the Puritans and the non-Puritans come up with an agreement. We promise to basically, rule this land based on ideas of liberty, private property ownership, etc., and religious freedom and freedom of thought, which is not true. All right, the Puritans will break this within the first couple of years. But nonetheless, all right, the Mayflower Compact is important. Now, interesting enough, the reason why this site was chosen here, you see Plymouth, is that there was already a town established there. There was a Native American village that had been established there. Now, as far as we can tell, about 5 years prior to the Pilgrims arriving, and we'll call them Pilgrims and Puritans because, again, that's kind of the thing. Prior to the Pilgrims arriving, the natives living there apparently were visited by a group of Spanish traders. They came, traded a couple things, and then left. Unbeknownst to the natives, one of the Spanish merchants had smallpox. Right? And once it spread, it basically wiped out the entire village. So kind of a weird story is that this village was basically abandoned because everyone in the village had died of smallpox. Now, much like in Jamestown, the first year or two of the settlement here was incredibly difficult. All right, the early crops didn't really come in, and there was a lot of hunger. Not as bad as Jamestown. If you all recall, Jamestown got to the point where they were literally eating each other. Right, but here in Plymouth, things were bad. But the difference is that unlike in Virginia, here in Plymouth, you have a nearby group of relatively friendly Native Americans. All right, led by the kind of the chief mediator between the natives, the Wampanoags, as they're known, and the Pilgrims was Massasoit. Interesting enough, Massasoit was actually a Native American who was actually captured by another group of Europeans, had been taken to England, lived there for quite some time, and then had been brought back, and he found his way back to his tribe, and so he knew English. Right? And so Massasoit kind of became like kind of the go-between between the Wampanoags and the settlers of Plymouth. Now, eventually, the Wampanoags were able to teach the Puritans how to do things like grow crops and basically survive. Right? And eventually, right, a harvest came in really well, and so they invited a couple of hundred of the Wampanoags into a feast of Thanksgiving, which we celebrate today. But remember, keep in mind that the first Thanksgiving was not located in Plymouth. It was located where? I think I told you all, right? Yeah. All right, it was actually located here in El Paso County, or, depending on who you believe, in St. Augustine, Florida, which were both Spanish colonies. All right, Spanish both gave meals of thanks, and it was actually decades before the Pilgrims did. All right, the reason why that's commemorized in the one here or the one in Florida is not is because here they, quite frankly, spoke English. That's really the only reason. Now, nonetheless, so the colony of Plymouth survived and began to slowly prosper. With the success of the Plymouth colony, the Crown of England decided to expand its territory further north. Now remember, up until this point, this area of this part of the world was not really English territory. But nonetheless, when the Crown heard about the success of Plymouth, it encouraged others to basically move into the area and begin settling as well. So another group of Puritans, still in England, founded what is known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a little further north of Plymouth, about 10 years later, in 1630. All right, founded the city, what became Boston, and they became incredibly successful. All right, so now you have two separate Puritan colonies here in what is now New England. Now, again, it's important to note the difference between one and the other in terms of between Virginia and New England, in terms of lifestyle, in terms of the big thing is really religion. All right, remember, and when I say these, Massachusetts and Plymouth are both religious colonies. Right? They're founded on the principle of, I guess, their Calvinist-inspired religion and their faith. Virginia, they're in it to make money. Yes, religion, I'm sure, plays a role in Virginia, but here it is intertwined. This, by all definition, all right, these colonies in Massachusetts are what we call a theocracy. Right? A theocracy literally means, so this word, oh, by the way, I should probably mention this already if you haven't figured it out already. For some reason I have the handwriting of a 5-year-old and I apologize, so this is why I usually like to type everything, but it is what it is. Theocracy, Theocracy. Theocracy, the word crusy, the suffix crusy literally means rule of. Theo in Greek refers to God. Theo, Deo, Dios, right? So this literally means the rule of God, according to their interpretation. And so, this is important to as we continue on our lecture about Massachusetts and Plymouth in general, because this is what is the foundation of this colony, right? Their idea of what a godly settlement will look like. Right? Now, the other big thing is the issue of economics. Because again, yes, this is a godly colony, but they still need to make money. They still need to pay the bills. Now, in Virginia, needless to say, the name of the game is tobacco, as we discussed. Now, in Massachusetts, you can't grow tobacco. It is far too cold, and the soil is not that great. However, you do begin to see a prosperous colony being formed out of fishing and lumber. All right, those two things, right, really allow the colony to survive. Now, you may say to yourself, well, why fish and lumber? Well, quite frankly, by this time, the early 1620s, fish and lumber in England and in Europe in general is becoming scarce. Right? Most of the forests and most of the rivers have been already plucked dry over the last few thousand years, and so all of a sudden now you have this seemingly unlimited supply of lumber and fish, so they can ship over to Europe and sell for a pretty good price. Now, the other big difference between Virginia and Plymouth is that, remember, in Virginia, the majority of the people arriving in Plymouth are young single men, all right, looking for a plot of land. Families will come later. Women, every once in a while, but for the most part, it's young single men. In Plymouth, it is entire families. So it's not uncommon for an entire family to essentially settle in and move in at the same time. All right? It's very rare that you'll have a single man or a single woman arriving in Plymouth at this early point of the colonial phase. Now, another big difference, and it kind of ties into this thing, is the distribution of land. Now, in Virginia, it's basically, if you got money, you can pretty much pay for your land. Okay? Your wealth is relative to how much land you own, right? In Massachusetts, it's different. All right, even in the early colony, all right, when a new family moved into the region and moved into the town, right, the town government would actually come together and, based on the size of the family, right, would distribute land for them. All right, pretty much here, this is your land. Good luck. All right, there's no sale tax. There's no real estate. There's nothing. It's just basically the town would get together and say that you have a family of 6. Here, this is land equivalent to you. All right, now, if a family of 11 came on board, then they would get more land. So the size of your holding would be based proportionate on the amount of children you have. Does that make sense? Now, so needless to say, this is basically an early form of land distribution, right? Where these individuals were more interested in essentially dispensing land based on the needs of a particular family. This is very different in Virginia, where it's basically just again an open market. If you can afford land, you can buy land. If you can't, well, good luck. Any questions? Now, this early form of government, so even in this early colonial phase in Plymouth, the majority of the governance was done by these town halls. Yes, Plymouth has a governor and they have other important officials, but Plymouth and the other little towns that will form in New England after this are governed by town halls. All right, the people will get together and will share grievances, they will discuss possible laws, etc., etc. And again, the first governor of Plymouth, John Winthrop, actually not the first governor, but after everything is settled, he does become governor and establishes this idea of this theocratic form of government, right? Where he referred to this passage of the Bible which calls for a shining city on the hill. He believed that Plymouth would serve as an example to the rest of the world of how a godly administration can really benefit society. So he really bought into this whole, again, shiny city on the hill, God, a run colony. Now, by the way, this picture has no relevance. I just love it because they're all, look at them. They look horrible. But I have no idea who this picture is. I just saw it and it's like, God, it is of the era, but that's it. They all look miserable. And this kid, I can't tell if he's 52 or 8. Anyway. Now here's the thing. First 10 or so years of Plymouth, things go all right. Things are fine, whatever. But as time progresses, you begin to see disagreements, particularly among the issue of faith. Now, an example of this is one of the first examples of this kind of controversy, this debate among the religious, is that of Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams is a Puritan preacher. He's a minister, and he has significant issues with how the colonies are treating the Native Americans. He believes that the Native Americans, much like everyone else, are God's children and should be treated with dignity and respect. And Roger Williams believes that by basically forcing the Native Americans out of their land, by not giving them compensation, we are violating God's law. And so Roger Williams is brazen in his outspoken criticism of the local colonial government, specifically when it comes to the treatment of Native Americans. It gets to the point where Roger Williams is actually arrested, charged with blasphemy. Blasphemy, speaking against the law of God. All right. Now, Roger Williams, eventually, usually people being accused of blasphemy and are actually sent to trial will probably be executed. But Roger Williams, because of his strong support within the community, eventually is just granted exile. He's forced out of the colony. So him and a couple of hundred of his followers, right, found the colony of, leave Plymouth, go west, and find the colony of Rhode Island, right, just right across the way. All right, so Rhode Island is established, and again, following the principles that he's espoused, any of the land that they settled on had to be purchased fairly and legally from the nearby Native Americans. Now, another kind of distraught Puritan minister, Thomas Hooker, finds basically finds more and more frustration here in Plymouth and decides to eventually stake out on his own and try to find a colony. Right? And again, a few years after Roger Williams, Thomas Hooker continues westward and finds a colony of Connecticut. All right, now, upon the discovery of the colony, or the founding of the colony, I should say, Roger Williams and the other colonists got together and created what is known as the Fundamental Orders. Now, these Fundamental Orders are essentially, basically, in many ways, the legitimate first constitution in American history. All right, it basically establishes what the government is, what its responsibilities are, and the individual rights of every colonist there. All right, this, by all means, is truly the first constitution in what becomes the United States. Remember, many people give credit to the Mayflower Compact, but it's actually the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut that this is established. Now, probably the most controversial of these renegades, of these, dissenters within the Puritan Church, is that of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson is the wife of another minister, and she causes controversy for not only speaking out against the leadership of this church, but not only that, her two biggest, I guess, not even mistakes, but her two biggest controversies are, number one, she holds Bible studies weekly Bible studies in her home. A woman leading Bible studies at this point in time is completely unheard of, at least in Puritan society. All right, so not only is this a woman hosting weekly Bible studies, all right, but also she is speaking out against, I guess what you would call standard religious practice. And I'll give you an example of this. Anne Hutchinson is a proponent of what is known as antinomianism. Now, she believed, if you recall, Calvinists and Calvinist-inspired religions believe that your fate, right, is not controlled by you. Remember, who controls who gets into heaven and hell according to, remember, Jean Calvin and this idea of predestination. Do you ever recall? Remember, yeah, God has a very short list of people who get in and who get out. Now, Puritanism is based in some forms on the ideas of Calvinism. All right, it's not a Calvinist religion per se, but it's inspired by it. Let's call it that. Now, the Puritans, over the last couple of decades, have kind of softened on the position of good deeds. All right, that, yeah, good deeds alone don't really, grant you access to heaven, but they don't hurt either. All right, so they're kind of softening on that position. And Hutchinson is saying absolutely not. Right, there is, this concept of good deeds and not grace, which is what's important. Right. This grace is what needs to be established. So this process of rejecting the established law within the Puritan Church is called antinomianism. And again, the whole premise of this is based on the idea that she rejects this idea that actions have anything to do with salvation. Nothing at all whatsoever, according to her. So these things combined, her preaching in her house and giving Bible studies, and her, openly rejecting principles within the church, eventually lead to her arrest. Now, to be fair, however, Anne Hutchinson, right, is also kind of weird. During her trial, she stands up and basically proclaims that she is God's prophet and God has given her a prophecy that He will kill everyone in this room. That's not really helping her defense, right? A person on trial threatening, or at least vaguely threatening everyone, it's not a good idea. Nonetheless, right, she is found guilty and is sentenced to death. However, before the sentence can be carried out, it is discovered that Anne Hutchinson is pregnant. Right? And so Puritans get together and say, well, we can't execute a pregnant woman, so they basically decide to exile her. Right? Anne Hutchinson eventually finds her way, and a group of her followers find her way up to, or down to Rhode Island. But nonetheless, this begins I guess what you would call, very kind of this late phase of Puritan rule in Plymouth. Right, the Puritans still have a control, a grasp on society here, but it will be one that will start to slowly loosen up over the next couple of decades. Now, kind of also not helping the situation of anxiety or controversy is the continuing tensions with the local Native Americans. So, despite the fact that the first Plymouth settlers were on friendly terms with the local Wampanoags, as they expand, they come into contact with more and more defensive and aggressive Native American entities. All right, and an example of this is that of the Pequots. The Pequots, or a Native American tribe that live here in what is now kind of in what is kind of on the border of what was Plymouth Colony. And as the Puritans begin to push further and further into their territory, the Pequots become more and more violent, eventually resulting in a large massacre of inhabitants. Now, in retaliation, the local Puritan settlers were able to kind of gather up their forces and eventually engage in their own massacre of Pequot Native Americans. Now, this Pequot War really does show the limits of this cooperation between the colonists and the Native Americans, right? That relationship that the Puritans, the original Puritans had with the Wampanoags is far, far gone. It's been 20 years already, almost 20 years, and that it does no longer exist. And so you have more and more violence taking place between European settlers and Native American peoples over their territory. Now, despite the Pequot War, despite the violence that it brought, the colony of the colony of Massachusetts in general, Plymouth, Massachusetts, whatever, begins to prosper, and you begin to see merchants becoming incredibly wealthy during this period of time, particularly those out of this new city of Boston. All right, the Boston merchants really do hold most of the wealth, most of the wealth of the society, and so the Boston merchant class all of a sudden show up. And remember, prior to this, for the most part, you basically have what we call a lack of social equity. In other words, the gap between the rich and the poor really doesn't exist for the first 20 or so odd years of society. But with the economy improving, with more people moving in and more money being made, that income disparity, that gap between those who have and those who have not, continues to grow. And this rise of this Boston merchant class, which have a lot, right, really does provide evidence of this. Now, let's talk a little bit about the issue of rights and liberties in England at this point in time, all right, which again will obviously transfer across the way to the Atlantic. In 1215, the nobles of England force the king of the time, John, to sign what is known as the Magna Carta. Now, this document, more than anything else, basically grants a sense of liberties and rights to nobles. Now, it's important to note that this is not, it basically recognizes certain rights and liberties that nobles have, but it's only for nobles. Everyone else, if you're not a noble, you're kind of left out. Nonetheless, it is an important document. Why? Because it establishes an agreement between the nobility and the crown that these are our rights and this is what you can and cannot do. All right, so starting from there, you begin to see, and just an example of this is this issue of habeas corpus. Does anyone know what habeas corpus is? You all should, because it applies to you. Here in the United States, habeas corpus does apply to you. Anyone know? All right, hopefully this has never happened to you. But in case you have ever been arrested, right, and they're supposed to tell you what your charge is. All right, that process of telling you that you're under arrest for X, Y, and Z is an example of habeas corpus. Right? There has to be a legitimate reason why you're being detained or arrested or charged, right, in order for you to be detained. They can't just arrest you because they feel like it. Well, to an extent. When we talk about the Constitution, I will tell you that your rights are not completely in concrete. But again, ideally, habeas corpus protects you from just basically what we call arbitrary arrest. They can't just arrest you because they feel like it. Right? So, I guess after the habeas corpus, the nobles basically, so prior to the habeas corpus, I'm sorry, not habeas corpus, the Magna Carta, I'm mixing my Latin together. The Magna Carta, prior to its signing, the king pretty much just ruled with the advice of a council, that he would call every once in a while and, sometimes take their advice, sometimes not. But the Magna Carta begins establishing this precedent that major decisions, especially when it comes to taxation, you have to have the consent of the nobles. And so the nobles eventually, they form small councils, but eventually this grows into a large advisory legislative body known as Parliament. Parliament is basically the English version of Congress, right, in many ways. It's basically a group of, there's two houses. The upper house is made up of a group of nobles, but the lower house is made up of a group of commoners. All right, but the Parliament in general is supposed to rule, or at least strongly advise the king, especially when it comes to issues of taxation. All right, taxation is what is most important in this regard. All right, it was established here in the Magna Carta that, or at least the idea that you have to pretty much, that the king just can't arbitrarily say, hey, you know what, we need more money, so I'm going to start taxing, shoes. You can't do that in England. All right, if you want to tax on shoes, you have to go to Parliament and say, hey, you know what, it'd be a good idea to raise taxes on shoes, and it's to pay for this, and so on and so forth. And Parliament will either grant it or deny it. Now, the problem is that in the 1600s, you begin to see tensions between Parliament and the king. Now, the king at this point in time is Charles, and Charles, to be fair, is kind of a, I was going to say the word, but no, it's kind of a jerk. Let's keep it PG. All right, it's kind of a jerk. And he didn't help the situation. Charles thought, so he looked at his neighboring France. France, really, the king of France at the time, Louis XIV, just pretty much did whatever he wanted. Really didn't consult with anyone, really just did whatever he wanted. And to Charles, that was so cool. Not having to consult Parliament with everything. And so kind of in trying to copy what Louis is doing in France, Charles tries to do the same thing. Doesn't really want to consult Parliament, doesn't really want to do anything, And here's the thing is that Parliament is only supposed to be called by the king whenever he needs something. But he went out of his way not to call them. So you may ask yourself, well, what if he needs tax money, whatever? He actually went through the books and found old taxes that were in the books for like 800 years that hadn't been, that just weren't collected anymore. But he actually went back, did his homework, and basically just found old taxes since almost the Roman times and decided, yeah, this is how we're going to fund the government. However, and that probably would have worked, and he probably could have kept on doing that if it wasn't for one huge mistake. Charles, at the time, is not only the King of England, he's also the King of Scotland. And the Scots are not members of the Church of England. All right, they, for the most part, many Scots are either have remained Catholic or are now Presbyterian. FY, it's basically another form of Calvinism. Charles really finds this annoying and really, really, really prefers that the Scots adopt the Church of England. And he basically imposes on them. And the first step is by forcing what is known as the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer is the standard go-to prayer book in England. And he forces the Scots to adopt this book. This one forcing of this religious imposition eventually convinces the Scots that this is only the beginning. It's only going to get worse from here. And so they decide to revolt. And not only do they revolt, they actually organize an army and march south to London to probably kill Charles. And so Charles needs to defend himself. How do you defend yourself if you're a king?
Hiding in your palace.
The what?
Hiding in your palace.
Well, hiding in your palace can only take you so much. They're going to eventually find you. You said right now? An army, right?
It's a funded army.
Yeah, but that's my point, is that in order to raise an army, you need soldiers, right? And in order to raise soldiers, you need what? Money. In order for a government to get money,
Taxation.
you need taxation. So, Charles calls Parliament, and Parliament goes, well. We'll help you, we'll give you the money that you need, but we have some demands. And by some, they mean a lot, like a lot of demands. Because they know they have Charles in the corner. Charles, offended at the idea that Parliament would use this moment of crisis that, by the way, he created to get more for themselves, he orders the arrest of the ringleaders of Parliament, about 20 or so odd guys. Right? These guys get tipped off and they flee. And they say that basically Charles has lost his mandate to rule. Right? It's us or him. And so the English Civil War begins. Now, I'm not going to get into the very nitty-gritty of it. All I'm going to make you remember is that, first of all, the war is basically between the royalists, who are known as the Cavaliers, and the Roundheads, who are the parliamentarians. So again, parliamentarians, those forces who support Parliament, Cavaliers, those who support Charles. They're called Roundheads because of the helmets they use. They look like erasers on a pencil. Now, eventually, all right, long story short, Charles is defeated and he is caught trying to sneak out of the country. And he's put on trial. Now, here's the thing, is that most members of Parliament at this point in time are hoping that he acknowledges that he messed up and will accept basically co-rule with Parliament. That is their hope. Right? That he just kind of gets a slap on the wrist, says he's sorry, and accepts Parliament's demands. But remember, Charles is a jerk. So he, during the trial, he gets, when it's his turn to testify, he stands up and basically says, I don't recognize any of you. This is a bullshit trial by a bullshit judge, and you all are just commoners. I am the King of England. All right? I have the authority to raise these judges in these trials, and you have no authority to judge me. So he basically told them to, F off. Let's call it that. Not a good idea. Because again, all of a sudden, Parliament, in a very unprecedented move, decides they have no choice but to execute Charles. Right? No one had originally wanted to do it, but Charles had left them no choice. And so, Charles is beheaded. You see his cabeza there? Yeah, that's Charles, or was left. All right, and so Charles is beheaded, and for the next 10 years, England is run as a semi-military dictatorship, with this man, Oliver Cromwell, as its head. Now, Oliver Cromwell is a minor noble, but most importantly, he is a devout Puritan, and runs England as a puritanical country. He bans alcohol and smoking and dancing. It's kind of lame. So this period of time that Oliver Cromwell is running the government is known as the interregnum. Now, how this affects all of this in North America. All right, I know we're talking about English history a lot, but let me talk about how this affects everything going on there. All of this is going on, at least the English Civil War, all of this is going on during this early colonial period. And for the most, what it does is create a huge wave of migrants from England to the colonies. All right, people trying to avoid the war, trying to avoid the bloodshed and the violence, all right, eventually make their way to the colonies. And even then, the Puritans in New England are revitalized. All of a sudden now you have a Puritan in government, not on the throne, but basically calling the shots. And so it does have a tremendous effect on what's going on in England, at least New England, at least for a while. All right, next thing we're going to do is just briefly cover the first couple of slides of chapter 3, and then we'll call it a day. Oh wait, this is supposed to be chapter 3, I'm sorry. Oh. All right, so. Now, very briefly, I want to talk about how the economic system is run in the colonies and how they specifically kind of answer to the mother country. Now, England, much like France and much like Spain, have an economic theory called mercantilism. Now, the idea behind mercantilism is basically relatively simple. Mercantilism teaches that when a country founds a colony, that colony serves two purposes. Number one, as a provider of natural resources. All right, so here in the colonies, for example, all right, their job is to provide natural resources to what is known as the metropole. A metropole is the mother country. All right, so in this case, New Spain's metropole is Spain, and Virginia's metropole is what? England. All right, very good. So again, the first purpose of a colony in terms of in regard to mercantilism is to provide natural resources. Tobacco, fish, lumber, whatever. The second purpose is to provide a market for goods. So ideally speaking, when something is produced in the colonies, let's say for example, you have lumber being essentially being shipped out of Boston back to England. All right. Once it is there, that lumber will be given to a furniture maker, and he will make a chair out of it. All right. That furniture maker will then load his chair onto a ship and send it back to Boston. So that way, a colonist can pay for that chair. So again, not only is it to provide natural resources, but also to provide a market for manufactured goods. Now, you may say to yourself, wouldn't it be easier for someone here to make a chair? Yes, it is. But that's not the goal. The goal is to essentially provide a protected market for those English manufacturers. All right, that is the goal. All right, needless to say, this causes an uptick in prices. Remember, when you're looking for something either local, that can be made locally, or you have to ship across the Atlantic, which was going to cost more? The one way over there. All right. Also, there's import taxes, fees, etc., etc. It's not a good deal for the colonists, nonetheless. And needless to say, these things, the Navigation Acts, which enforce this, basically the Navigation Acts makes it. There's several of them, but the big idea out of all of them is that and this is the thing. Even let's say, for example, that the price of lumber in England crashes. Or all of a sudden now you're basically being paid pennies for tons and tons of lumber. Technically speaking, legally speaking, you cannot sell the lumber anywhere else. Let's say that there is a demand for lumber in France, you can't sell it to a French merchant legally. All right, you're breaking the law. Now, is this stopping anyone? Absolutely not. All right, smuggling is a proud American tradition. All right, and so yeah, you have English merchants conducting business with French merchants, with Spanish merchants, with anyone who's willing to do business. Because why not? Right? The English Navy, as powerful and as influential as it is, cannot 100% protect against smuggling. It just can't. It's logistically impossible. All right? And so, despite mercantilist laws, and despite how harsh they are, there's not that many people being arrested on an annual basis for breaking the Navigation Acts. It's just not possible. Now, if you recall, the area what is now New York started off as a Dutch colony. New Netherlands here, as you can see here in blue, this area that goes all the way down from New Jersey all the way up to eastern New York was originally a Dutch colony. All right, the Dutch had been ruling it for about the last 20 or so odd years and had created a relatively prosperous colony. However, in 1664, after a brief but decisive war, England annexes, in other words, seizes this territory, and it now becomes New York. Kind of a funny story. During this war, the Dutch send word to the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, which becomes New York, and tells them, like, hey, war broke out between us and England. Get the colony ready. They're eventually come for you. So yeah, they convert the island of Manhattan into a fortress. They basically prepare for an invasion. As a matter of fact, for those who are familiar with New York, the area of Wall Street, right, which is very famous today, obviously, all right, that was actually called that because there was actually a wall where that street runs today, all right, to defend the western half of that. Despite all the preparation, despite all this planning, et cetera, the second the English arrive, the first thing the Dutch governor does is surrender. Right? He looks at the size of the fleet and says nope, and just surrenders over to the English. All right. So now the Dutch, during their reign and rule over what becomes New York, had essentially established a relatively free society, even one that included protections against black colonists, or for black colonists, I should say, forgive me. When the English arrive, within a few years, they rewrite the laws so that essentially, it basically creates a discriminatory, racist policy against both free and enslaved people of African descent. All right, so you do begin to see this change, not just for black colonists, but even women. In Dutch society, women have an extensive amount of rights. They can own and conduct business. They can sign contracts. They can file for divorce for relatively simple reasons. When England takes over and it becomes a colony of New York, those rights for women, particularly those to divorce and to sign contracts, essentially disappears. Now, the English do begin to realize the importance of having some political alliances with the nearby nations. Now, here in Western New York, you have a group of Native Americans collectively known as the Iroquois. Now, the Iroquois, much like if you remember when we're talking about the Apache, there's the Apache, but they're divided among the Chiricahuas, the Mescaleros, the Lipan. There's a bunch of Apache subgroups. Much like the same thing with the Iroquois. The Iroquois are just they share a common language, but they're divided politically. Nonetheless, there are 5 very powerful tribes here in Western New York that form an alliance together, known as the 5 Nations. The English strike a deal with them, all right, basically forming an alliance known as the covenant chain. All right, now the purpose of this chain, more than anything else, was to protect against the French. The French up here have their own system of alliances with various Native American tribes, particularly the Huron. The Huron and the Iroquois are constantly at each other and have been for quite some time. And so it's only natural that the French would take one side and the English would take the other. All right, but again, important to note that the English had established an alliance with the nearby tribes, and or the nearby Iroquois tribes, known as the covenant chain. Now, the English, again, upon seizing the colony of New York, established a system of governance known as the Charter of Liberties and Privileges. Now, this is a pretty common process here in which whenever a colony is founded, it's common practice by now that the colony will basically establish a rule of self-governance. Needless to say, the colonies themselves are still technically answer to the king, but for the most part, we start to see a tradition of self-governance here, all right, where the colonies pretty much manage most of their own affairs, for the most part. All right, here in New York, it's not any different. The Charter of Liberties and Privileges not only establishes a form of government, but also makes it very clear that these that are listed are your rights. More than anything else, it protects basically property owners from seizures, assets, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it does establish a system of, I guess what you would call a Bill of Rights in this particular regard. Now, let us travel southward to South Carolina. Now, South Carolina started out as an extension not of Virginia, but actually of the Caribbean. If y'all recall, the English had established several colonies in the Caribbean. The most prominent one is the island of Barbados. Remember, Barbados becomes kind of the home of the British economic life because it produces so much sugar. So many of the original first colonists here in Carolina were actually from Barbados, right? And they come basically to establish a secondary colony here. Now, originally, because again, remember, Barbados by all trades is a slave colony. When the first settlers arrived here in Carolina, they had attempted to enslave the local native population. Right? But again, the native population, because of disease, because of abuse, because of various other aspects, eventually quickly was wiped out. All right? And so you begin to see this Indian slavery being replaced with African slaves specifically. Now, the colony itself could not grow sugar. Sugar requires very high temperatures and very high humidity. Carolina, yeah, it's hot, but it's nowhere near as hot as it is. It snows in Carolina on occasion. And so, eventually, it is decided on rice, right, which becomes pretty profitable. All right, rice becomes the main cash crop in Carolina at this point in time. And again, much like sugar in itself, rice is very manual intensive. It requires a lot of labor, which is why you see this perpetuation of slavery in Carolina. And again, much like in New York, the colonies in Carolina established what is known as the fundamental constitutions. Again, the fundamental constitutions being the kind of governing document of Carolina. Remember, it is very, very common for this to be created. Now, here's the thing. This document kind of really does show the difference between New York and Carolina. And what I mean by this is that the Constitution of Carolina kind of creates this feudalistic society, where in other words, the wealthiest landowners in Carolina will receive titles of nobility, lord, duke, whatever. All right? And it created a very, very medieval system of government. Eventually, this constitution will be kind of thrown out and replaced with something more modern, but it goes to show you where the mindset of these individuals are, where these wealthy landowners saw themselves as basically royalty on this side of the Atlantic. All right, very interesting. Now, as I mentioned when we talked about the Reformation, there are various branches of Christianity that break out in this early Reformation phase. There's Lutheranism, there's Calvinism, there's Presbyterianism, there's all these different branches. One of the more fascinating ones that develops later on in England is one that is known as Quakerism. Now, Quakerism is not, they don't call themselves that. They refer to themselves as a society of friends, but it is a religious organization. And one of the things, and there's a couple of important things, and I'm just going to I'm not going to remember any of them. All right. Basically, what it is that their congregations do not really they have ministers leading them, but for the most part, you're supposed to sit in silence during your services. And if you feel that God is speaking to you, you're encouraged to stand up and say whatever it is God is telling you. All right. And sometimes the light of God is so powerful that it will actually cause you to tremble or quake. That's where the word comes from, right? Get it? Quake, yeah. Now, there's a couple of other interesting aspects of Quakerism. First of all, the idea that everyone inside of them has a divine spark, a soul, whatever you want to call it. All right, so all of a sudden, Quakers are one of the first religious societies to actively speak out in favor of abolition, because again, the idea that everyone has that divine spark within them, everyone has that light of God in them, including those in bondage, right? Now, the other thing, needless to say, is that much like most minor early religions, they're also persecuted. Both the Anglicans, not only the Anglicans and the Catholics, but even the Puritans here in New England begin persecuting them as well. And so, probably the most wealthiest and prominent Quaker in English society, a man named William Penn, is able to purchase a huge swath of land from the King of England. All right, and essentially creates a colony, a safe, much like Maryland was supposed to be a safe haven for Catholics. This new colony here, north of Maryland, what he defined Pennsylvania, all right, would be a safe haven for Quakers. All right, now, even though it was supposed to be a safe haven for Quakers, it was pretty much open for everyone. The whole purpose of this was supposed to be for religious toleration, and it was. Not only do you have religious toleration, but you also have, you also have basically land being sold for cheap. William Penn wasn't really interested in making huge swaths of money by just selling land. He just wanted people to live in his colony. Now, William Penn, because he technically owns the colony, it is known as a proprietary colony, which means that he, at the end of the day, really calls the shots. Needless to say, the colony itself is still, technically everyone's supposed to listen to the King of England, but he's the one who makes the laws. He's the one who dictates policy there. Now, William Penn has a pretty open policy when it comes to self-governance. He allows the Pennsylvanians, for the most part, to manage their own day-to-day affairs. All right, that he just does it. All right, but again, because of the availability and the affordability of land, Pennsylvania becomes the most prosperous and largest of these colonies. All right, very quickly. All right, the colony of Pennsylvania grows far beyond what's happening in New England or even in Virginia, for that matter. All right, because again, cheap land and it's pretty available pretty much anywhere, and it's good land. Now, much like Roger Williams in Rhode Island, William Penn also is a firm believer in fair trade with the Native Americans, and so any land being acquired by Pennsylvania has to be legally and ethically bought from the Native Americans. All right. Now, early on, while William Penn is alive, this is absolute policy. However, upon his death, all right, this kind of becomes more and more ignored, and you begin to see Pennsylvania expanding at the cost of the local Native American tribes without compensation. The last thing I'll talk about is this issue of slavery, because I've kind of been touching on it, but I want to kind of really get into it. Now, the early colonial society, let's say up until about 1660, it's not to say that racism didn't exist, but what we call institutionalized racism, all right, where colonies are actually making laws making it almost impossible for slaves to get freedom, or even free men, free African men of African descent, to buy property or to serve on juries, things like this. You really don't see that happening until after about 1660, all right, where you do really begin to see institutionalized racism. Remember, keep in mind that even then, the idea of race in itself is one that is very, very ridiculous at the end of the day. All right, because again, thanks to DNA testing, we now know that the difference in terms of genetics between you and myself and anyone else on this planet is less than 0.3%. And even then, there is no, special difference between someone from one particular ethnic group and another one. Right? Race in itself is really a construct. Nonetheless, it is one that we have to acknowledge, right? Because it does play a significant role in this regard. Right? And so, the first few decades of this particular colonial institution, right, Virginia, Massachusetts, now Pennsylvania, and Carolina, doesn't really emphasize the issue of race. Right? You do have some African slaves, however, for the most part, they are domestic servants. They're inside, and there are very stringent laws protecting them from abuses. However, this changes quite rapidly. Now, slavery in itself is not a uniquely European thing. It is not an American thing. Right? Slavery is one of the oldest institutions in world history. Right? Most slaves, even in the earliest complex society in world history, Mesopotamia, slavery is an institution. Now, most slaves in Mesopotamia, in this early ancient society, were actually prisoners of war or people who accumulated debt. Even in the Old Testament, according to the Old Testament of the Bible, all right, men, if you have accumulated a significant amount of debt, right, you can actually sell your family into slavery. Sorry, ladies, you can't sell your husband into slavery. right? It's very specific. Yeah, I know, it's really, really shady, but nonetheless, right, slavery is an institution. However, it's almost like a form of indentured servitude, right, where basically once you pay off your debt, your master has to let you go, right? Now, what is going on here, and what we are familiar with in slavery in the United States, is what we call chattel slavery. Do I have it here? No, I don't. Chattel slavery is where slaves are not only just slaves, they are property. All right, and for the most part, that also implies that they're manual laborers. They work out in the fields. Now, English slavery within the English government becomes more and more prioritized with the colonies of the West Indies. If you all recall, the islands of Barbados, Jamaica, etc., are sugar plantations. And I think I mentioned this before, sugar processing is incredibly difficult, right? The process of actually turning sugar cane into sugar is one that is laborious, it is dangerous, it is very difficult to do. And so, the demand for slave labor is more and more prioritized. All right? And so, at first, but here's the thing, is that slavery from Africa was not really done for quite some time because, quite frankly, slaves from Africa are expensive. To transport them, to capture them, to transport them, and to bring them back, it's incredibly cost heavy. And so for many, there's an attempt to, first of all, to try to get Native Americans enslaved. But again, as I mentioned, Native Americans quickly died because of disease and other hardships, and so you just basically don't have a sustainable population. And even then, there was an attempt to bring in indentured servants. If you all recall, those settlers from England who wanted to come and work, right, in exchange for their debt. But even then, that was problematic because remember, like I said, sugar plantations are living nightmares. All right, the process of actually, it's hot, it's humid. The sugar itself, it burns. After a while, it burns your skin. And even then, the sugar cane attracts animals, looking for sugar, but then also attracts predators. So it's not uncommon for a worker within the fields to be attacked by a jaguar or another animal like that. It's not an ideal situation. All right. As a matter of fact, the average lifespan of an African slave working in Barbados, all right, in a sugarcane plantation, is 3 years. Right. That is how long from the time that they are brought into the plantation to the time that they die of exhaustion, illness, infection, etc. It's 3 years. All right, on average. So again, with this lack of labor in the form of Native American slavery and indentured servants, you essentially have no choice but to begin the importation of African slaves. Now, eventually, however, you begin to see this desire for manual labor spread even into the American colonies. And so, with more and more slaves being imported by 1660, you begin to see the colonial assemblies establish laws, essentially legislating on slavery and slaves, right? And these are collectively known as the slave codes. Now, most of these slave codes, it depends on the colony. Each colony had their own different set of codes, but for the most part, they had some protections for slaves on paper. They weren't really enforced. All right, but even then, you also had laws, for example, in some colonies, you had complete prohibitions of buying your way into freedom. There are stories of slaves who have developed a particular skill, will eventually, they learn how to blacksmith, they'll do this on the side in their free time, and then eventually get enough money to buy their freedom. Some colonies actually outlawed that outright. All right, it also established things like, for example, if the English law established a system by which even if you are 1/124th black, right? Let's say that your great grandfather was black, slave, free, doesn't matter. You, by that definition, are still black, right? Which incredibly limits your rights and your freedoms in both the colonies and in England. Now, it's not to say that this was it was needless to say an incredibly segregated society, but you do see issues of mixed race people. Now, early on, whenever, and again, you have slave masters who sexually abuse, rape their female slaves, and eventually they get pregnant and they have a child. All right, now, originally, early on, most of these children were granted their freedom. It didn't necessarily mean that they were part of the plantation or his family, just meant that they were born free. However, as time progresses and this becomes more common, you have the codes being changed so that now all of a sudden children born of any slave, regardless of who the father was, are also slaves as well. All right, so as we see, over time, the laws of these colonies, the codes that guide them, become more and more inherently racist. Right? More and more inherently discriminatory against not only enslaved Africans, but even those who are free. Any questions? All right, y'all. I think I've talked too much already. Next time, we will go over, we'll finish up chapter 3 and start on chapter 4. Just a reminder, the weekly assignments are still due. I think that's about it. Anything else I'm forgetting? Sorry? Oh yeah, that's what I'm about to do. Just what I'm about to say, one more thing. Right, once I call your name, y'all are free to go, okay? Laura?